Welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and I'm absolutely delighted to have on today someone I've known for a good few years now, and I've interviewed before, and it's going to be interesting to see what changes there are in this interview compared to the last one, and just to get an update for a new audience for you. I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Aaron Adair, and Aaron Adair released this book all the way back in 2013, and it is a fantastic book. And in fact, Richard Carrier said this is the go-to book on the Star of Bethlehem. It's called The Star of Bethlehem, A Skeptical View. It's a fantastic book, absolutely loved it. But before we get stuck into that SOB, that Star of Bethlehem, I would like to introduce you, or at least ask Aaron to introduce himself to you. So Aaron, welcome to the show. And would you like to just give us a little intro as to who you are, where you've come from, your journey possibly to writing the book, and just a little bit about yourself?
All right, yeah, so just a little bit of background so that way I can at least pretend like I'm somehow an authority on this sort of subject. I originally wrote this book pretty much towards the tail end of finishing my PhD in physics from The Ohio State University. And yes, the is part of the official name. My university truly is the definite article.
Excellent, nice.
I actually stole that joke from an old episode of Doctor Who. Nonetheless, so my PhD is in physics, focused mostly on physics education and a little bit of physics history as well. Currently, I also continue that sort of research. I'm a research affiliate at MIT because I'm here in the Boston area, and I get to harass some of the people around here that are very smart and work on extending some of the same research that I've done in the past. Worked as a professor at a couple different colleges, and currently work as a data scientist. So huge amounts of data, Bayes theorem, that's part of my day job now. I originally got into this subject somewhat serendipitously. It was towards the beginning of my college career, and I was able to start working as a planetarium show presenter at the college campus planetarium back in Michigan State. And around Christmas time, we have our annual seasonal show. It was the first time I remember going to one of these seasonal shows and presenting it, and was just blown away when they said, we can use all of our astronomical knowledge, wind back the clock, and show there's this beautiful combination of the stars and planets at this particular time in this particular location, just in time for the alleged Christmas miracle. And especially at that time, I was what I call myself a Catholic deist at that time. So using the laws of physics to regenerate this sort of miracle was just exactly what I would expect that sort of God to do. Unfortunately, I do remember then going home for the holidays, seeing a program on television about that time, and it presented a different theory. And I'm like, wait a minute, how'd that happen? I thought our planetarium was the one, showing the real deal. And then I find out, no, there's not a few different theories, not even a dozen. Pretty much anything and everything has been called the Star of Bethlehem by somebody, including some things that are totally fictitious. So that started my rabbit hole, started researching it. My first publication on it was actually for Sky and Telescope back in 2007, when everything was still on paper. And then it generated into additional research about the history of the subject, about why the naturalistic theories exist, why they don't work, and ultimately coalescing into the greatest book ever written, which everyone should get at least 10 copies of. You could read it more quickly if you have 10 copies.
This is a fact. It's an absolute fact. I'm glad you said that. It is definitely the best. Well, other than my ones, it's definitely one of the best books.
Yes, there's some stiff competition out of your publishing house.
So, and you put together the case, but what is your case? I mean, I think you say quite a number of different things in the book, which makes for interesting reading, because there's dipping into the history of science at the time, or kind of the history of sort of, I don't know, astronomy and astrology as well, and sort of tying these two sort of disciplines together, if you can call one a discipline, and also with what the Gospel of Matthew says, and the idea that the Gospel of Matthew is the only gospel that recounts the Star of Bethlehem. So what does that say? There's a little bit of biblical exegesis that you do in the book. And then looking at the naturalistic explanations and that versus just a simple supernatural explanation. Can you talk us through, I suppose, what the claims of Matthew are, first of all, and then we can go from there?
Yeah. So pretty much everything we have about the Star of Bethlehem is summarized in just 12 lines of the Gospel of Matthew. And everything after that point that talks about the star is almost certainly derivative of Matthew and making up things as they go along. So pretty much if there's anything possibly historical, it's almost certainly going to just be in those 12 verses. And of those 12, there's only a few that give any actual details about the star itself. But the basic background is the story takes place towards the end of the reign of King Herod, Herod the Great, who most historians will say died around 5 or 4 BCE. And at that time, these Magi, or wise men, as it's translated in your King James Bible, come saying, where's the newborn king of the Jews? We're searching for him. We want to worship him. We've seen his star. And again, translation will say either in the east or at the rising, or at its rising. Herod, of course, is like, wait a minute, I'm the king. I didn't just have another baby and I would know. I'm a 70-year-old man.
Nice.
And apparently, of course, this is, very troubling to him. And according to the story, not just him, but all of Jerusalem was basically terrified by this news. So Herod basically invites them in to find out what they know. He brings together the various scholars, the priests, rabbis, what have you, to ask, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? Tell them in Bethlehem. Then tells the Magi, okay, you go head on to Bethlehem, find the child, tell him so that way I can come and worship him too. In which case you now have to imagine Herod, sitting there twirling his mustache as evilly as possible, because everyone knows that Herod is a not good person. At this point, he's already executed 3 of his sons in just the last 2 years. Even Caesar Augustus was like, I'd rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son.
Yeah, so he's not a nice guy. I mean, it fits in. So what happens next, as we know, the slaughter of the innocents fits into what we might expect someone like Herod to have done. However, of course, and this is a problem with the story so far that you've just recounted, is that there's no corroborating evidence of this at all. So Josephus, who notes a lot down about the history of Herod and his life, mentions nothing about the upcoming events. And of course, when you talk about the scribes in Jerusalem and everyone knowing about this star and this new Messiah to be born, and this is all big news. Of course, it's not recounted anywhere outside the Gospel of Matthew, so this is also problematic. But yes, so carry on.
Exactly. Yeah. Which then basically gets us to like the one verse about the star that gives like any details about what it does, where the Magi head out, and lo and behold, the star which they'd seen before is going before them until it arrives at its appropriate location and hovers over where the child is. The Magi then are super happy. They go into the house where Jesus is at, give him gifts, and then they're told in the dream, by the way, run. Herod's a bad dude. You might not have heard about that in Act 1, but run. And they head off to their homeland by another route. The Holy Family also gets told in another dream to get out of Dodge. And then Herod, finding out he's been tricked, sends the army to slaughter the various young babies in Bethlehem. And as you note, there's no historical record of that, but that's at least the story as we have it.
Yeah, and I talk a lot about this in my own book, The Nativity, a Critical Examination, where I discuss the whole nature, and I've done a video on the dream sequence of the Magi, where it doesn't make much sense, because surely they would have had a dream before getting to Jerusalem. Why? What God does is allow the Magi to get Herod involved, because I would posit, and I think you would agree, that really the star and the Magi are mechanisms to get Herod involved in the story, because Matthew needs Herod to be the new Pharaoh, and he needs to do the killing of the firstborn that Pharaoh did as a slaughter of the innocents, to get Jesus, the Holy Family, to escape to Egypt, to then come out of Egypt to fulfill the prophecy that out of Egypt I will call my son Israel. So this all looks like very much a set of literary mechanisms to get people involved in the story who otherwise wouldn't have been involved. But maybe I'm jumping ahead. If we go back to what you were saying about the star, first of all, we've got a dog leg. So we've got the Magi coming from the east, and they hit Jerusalem, and then Bethlehem is sort of south of Jerusalem. So they have to go like, so they follow the star, and then they lose the star in Jerusalem, which is very fortuitous, very convenient. And then Herod gets on board, and then they pick it up again, and it suddenly appears again, and then they go a sort of different direction. So that's a weird thing in and of itself. I mean, would that be the sort of thing that a natural star would do?
At the very least, a star that might be towards the south at one moment isn't going to stay in that direction, because all the stars in the sky are going to be moving from east to west just from standard diurnal motion due to the rotation of the Earth. It's going to be maybe at south at one moment, but 1 hour later, and it's going to take at least an hour to walk from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. It's about a 6 or so mile walk. So unless the Magi also have an automobile at the time, so they can do that more quickly, the star is going to have shifted very significantly from south towards the west. And also the details of the story, if we read them literally, the star doesn't just hang out in the south, it's actually traveling in that direction. It says that it's basically leading the Magi to their destination. And then when it gets there, it hovers over a particular location, like it's a giant GPS marker, and just pointing off the right house that they need to go to. And logistically, that's kind of what you would need, because we have from another sacred document what happens if you do not have an exact location. And by sacred document, I mean Monty Python and the Life of Brian.
Oh, nice. I like what you did.
Yes, as I like to call the Divine Comedy.
Nice.
That, yeah, if ultimately, for those who have not seen the movie, first off, shame on you. Secondly, shame on you. But thirdly, the story basically has that, you see the wise men, they're being led by the star, but they go ultimately to the wrong location. They give gifts to the wrong baby, but when they step out and see literally the glowing holy family in another location, they run back, grab their gifts, and then give it to the correct child. So you can imagine, if you are not being pointed in the right direction and you just happen to go to the first house with a 2-year-old son, what are the chances you're going to happen to have picked the Son of God? Okay, that we're going to really do a coin flip for who's going to be the Messiah.
Well, I mean, the nature of the problem is that you have, I mean, if you've ever looked in the sky before and seen stars, the stars are not very big. Okay, even if you're going to have some conjunction of planets or some, whatever theory, supernova, this or that, then they're not really very big, and they're not big enough to indicate an individual house amongst a bunch of houses that are next to each other, when you've got how you would look at houses and how you would look at stars. That whole scenario really talks to me, at least as a reader there, of a situation where it's clearly a supernatural star. However, we've had a long history of people trying to claim it's not a supernatural star. What is that as what you've said encompassed the story as we need to know it? Is there anything else to add to the story?
Other than if we want to get into the nitty-gritty details of any of the Greek words, but that's mostly just for if we're going to analyze any particular naturalistic hypothesis, how well does it explain this word? Or worse, when people propose a naturalistic hypothesis, they'll say, oh, this word actually means this. And you look it up and you find out, no, this person doesn't know what they're talking about.
Right. So I suppose then this is a good time to go on to naturalistic hypotheses. So what we have here is we have a story that to me looks overtly mythological, but if it's mythological, if it's not mythological, then it is supernatural. It's supernatural history of the supernatural. So it seems bizarre, because this, to me, again, clearly looks like a phenomenon that is not following natural law and adhering to the behavior of stars as we know them, or even supernovae or conjunctions. So we have a problem, but talk us briefly through the history of the naturalistic explanations and who and why.
All right. So I've in the digging I've done, the earliest encounters I have seen with people trying to propose a completely naturalistic star goes back to basically about the late 18th century in Germany, and in particular to a gentleman by the name of John Michaelis. And interesting person. He was probably the top Hebraist of his time in Europe, if you exclude anyone who actually spoke Hebrew. He, unfortunately, a lot of the scholarship at that time was rather anti-Semitic and said the Jews don't even know Hebrew, which, you know, is kind of absurd on its face, but that was part of their arguments for their own reconstructions of reading the Old Testament. But nonetheless, he was considered the top person when it came to studying Hebrew. He also spent a few years studying England. Basically, there was a foreign exchange student in the 1740s. At that time, there was a big thing going down in England called deism. And you have some of the first deist critiques of the supernatural and the Bible in particular. And he apparently shows some influence, because later when he goes back to Germany and he starts his own academic journal, he's actually spending his time finding these little known treatises from deists and, like, you know, critiquing them. And when I say little known, I mean literally, like, there's not even a copy in any library in the world now, that, like, nobody cares about these old books. But he spends, you know, page after page, you know, dissecting these relatively weak arguments, but also against the critique of supernaturalism in them. Now, why is anyone even doing this at this time? Basically, once people are starting to accept the Newtonian world and realize that the universe, I should say, works basically mechanistically. It can be predicted with great accuracy with a few pages of mathematics, and you can figure out where the planets were, or how comets are going to move about and things like that. Once you realize that that's how the world actually works, and that's the way allegedly then God sets things up, then why are there miracles in the first place? Why would then, of course, God make a perfect clock and then have to jam his hands in there every so often to get it to the right time? That looks like a bad mechanic.
Yeah.
So these are the sorts of critiques that are coming up against the miraculous. And of course, you have then David Hume in, what was it, 1748, publishing his critique of the very concept of miraculous testimony being ever strong enough to believe a miracle actually took place.
Yeah, so you've got the two problems here. You got one: why would God create a apparently clockwork universe and then have to mess around with it in order to have certain phenomenon that he wants to take place? Why couldn't he build that into the fabric of the universe in the first place, or the way that it works? And then you have the idea that you know, looking at probable causation and probability. Someone like Hume saying, well, actually, we don't have really epistemic warrant. We're not, like, justified in believing miraculous claim or claims of miracles, you know, compared to other hypotheses. So yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, so he seems to provide some of the earliest attempts to fix that problem. So he proposes perhaps it was a comet. And the way he writes about it, he seems to suggest that he doesn't know anyone else who's done this beforehand. So he's probably the first person to really push this. And then later there's an entire movement within biblical studies to take every miracle story of the New Testament and somehow find a naturalistic way of explaining it. The most famous individual who did this the most thoroughly was another German by the name of Heinrich Paulus. He's building on all this previous work, but basically going through every miracle story and said, here's how it really happened. Most famously or infamously is the explanation of how Jesus was walking on water. So it's a dark and stormy night. The disciples are out on their ship. The storm has gotten them all sorts of bungled about. They don't even know where they're at. They don't even realize that they're actually now stuck on the shore. So when Jesus comes up, and he's actually just walking along the shoreline, they mistake that and thinking, oh, they're actually out right in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and their Lord and Savior is walking on water.
Right. So just, yeah, complete, yeah, easily explained in that way.
Yes, easily. Easily being the word easily doing a lot of heavy lifting in that case.
yes, quite. Yeah.
And that was the sort of mentality they took to literally the entirety of the Bible, or as much as they could get away with, until people realize, okay, this doesn't explain this detail or that detail, or also just the basic question of, you know what, it's also pretty easy to explain this as it didn't happen, and this starts to look like literary motif. And again, a lot of this is taking place in Germany, and like the great book that basically pushes everyone to realize, okay, we need to stop this sort of nonsense, is a guy by the name of David Friedrich Strauss.
Yeah.
And he's a young man at the time. I think he's only like 25, and he writes this massive tome, which translated in English is titled "On the Life of Jesus, Critically Examined." And when I say critically, he will go through and he will use the most dreaded word in all of biblical studies. He'll use the M word, myth.
Right. So, I mean, this is interesting. So it started off as a process of trying to explain supernatural claims in the Bible in naturalistic terms, and yet still maintain that the Bible is some kind of true historical account. So that was the first step. And then the next step was to say that, if we can explain these naturalistically, then really we start deconstructing the Bible itself as far as the theology that you can attach to that very naturalistic looking stuff. And then it all starts looking rather mythological. Okay, interesting. So then what happens next after D.F. Strauss?
Yeah, so for Strauss himself, his personal life, it goes in a bad direction because, as you can imagine, publishing this book in still a relatively religiously conservative country, most of his fellow scholars are not on board with that yet. So he basically loses any chance for a professorship for a long time. In many ways, he's kind of like exiled. It's a very similar story, in fact, happens in more recent times with Thomas Thompson, New Old Testament scholar who basically was the first person to start arguing, the entire patriarch narrative, that's myth. There was never any historical Abraham or things like that. And he pretty much was in the academic wilderness for decades. I mean, he was even like, he went back to his home state of Michigan and was like a painter for years and years. I want to say painter, not artistic painter, like painting houses.
Yeah.
And now he's, one of the most important emeritus professors of Old Testament studies. A somewhat similar thing happening with Strauss, where everyone is like, no, you're absolutely nuts, get out of here. And then eventually scholars are like, he's probably right.
Yeah.
And eventually this also gets translated into English, and it also causes pretty much the same sort of scandal in England. But for the most part, from what I can tell from English literature, either everyone was on board with Strauss's saying, hey, this is mostly just storytelling, or they're just like, nope, supernaturalism totally happened. Those have become the two poles. There are very few rationalists in England in the 19th century. This only starts to change a bit in the 20th century. And from what I've been seeing with the history of why that happened, it's mostly an American problem. America, once again, has infected the world with these sorts of things. But that's something we can talk about a little bit later.
So alongside of this, we have this movement towards explaining the supernatural with the natural, and we have and also an advancing knowledge and understanding of how the cosmos works, how the solar system works. And so therefore these sort of people who are wanting to do this, including the cosmologists themselves or the astronomers themselves, can go about trying to explain these supernatural phenomena that they see in the Bible in terms of natural science.
Exactly, yeah. And as various things in the sciences are better understood, then they also tend to pop up as possible explanations. So early on, there isn't too much discussion of, say, supernovas, because the mechanisms for that were not really understood until basically the 20th century. Then you actually not only know what supernovas are, but then you can even start classifying them as different kinds of explosions. Like, oh, this is what happens when there's too much mass on a white dwarf and then it goes exploding. Or this is a star that's too massive and during its collapse, it undergoes implosion and then explosion. And all these different categorizations, once you understand the mechanisms really, really well, and then you can start saying, now we understand what this is, now maybe we can use it to explain the story. Now that it has gone from supernatural lights in the sky to completely mechanistic.
Cool. So what were the main or what are the main naturalistic explanations for the Star of Bethlehem then?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think what might be the best order to go through. I'll just quickly go through that. The first one was the idea that it was a comet careening through the sky, and that is usually something that gets people's attention. We have plenty of historical records that show that. though usually what they say is not that a king has come, they say, oh shit, the king's in trouble.
Yeah.
That's usually how that goes.
Comets are usually harbingers of doom, and they're not like positive omens. They're very much negative omens. Out of interest, would a comet be traveling too quickly for this to explain their entire journey?
If we're focused on basically the story as it takes place in Jerusalem, and that's like the only detail we have, the amount that a comet is going to move relative to the other stars in the sky is probably too small to notice by the naked eye. So the only motion the comet will have noticeably in that period of time is just due to the rotation of the Earth. Otherwise, from night to night, you'll notice the comet have moved an appreciable distance, but by naked eye over a couple of hours, probably not.
But would it, for their whole journey? I mean, that's obviously the Jerusalem part. If they are following a star from the beginning of their journey, I mean, it's very difficult. We haven't even really spoken about who the Magi are and how that translates.
True.
And
since we don't even know their starting location, but so it's also a bit confusing because the word Magi or magus from the Greek has a little bit of spread in valence. Originally, it was focused on a priesthood within the Zoroastrian faith, that basically all the priests to that religion were magos. In fact, the word itself comes from Persian. Later, the Greeks would use it and ultimately would replace their older word for a magician or wizard. So our word magic ultimately comes from the word magos. So it has that kind of spread. Okay, we're just talking about any garden variety person who can pull a rabbit out of his hat, or the ancient equivalent, or are we talking about the actual priesthood? I would argue because they specify Magi from the East, that sort of specification is supposed to say, hey, we're probably talking about those in the Persian Empire. It's also worth noting the only time the word magus is used in the Old Testament, in the Greek translation, in the Septuagint, it only shows up in the book of Daniel in reference to people within the Persian or Babylonian court. So they probably would have been thinking that.
Yeah, I would argue that we have a difference between the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. So they're the only two Gospels that are presenting the reader with evidence of a birth of Jesus and the Nativity. Luke's Gospel differs incredibly from Matthew's. Luke does not include any of the events to do with the star, the Magi, and Herod. Okay, Luke has Jesus being born in Bethlehem, but the parents coming down from Nazareth to Bethlehem for a census, and we won't go into how nonsensical that is, but they do that in Luke. Matthew appears to have them already living in Bethlehem, then running away because of Herod to Egypt, and then coming back and settling in Nazareth because it's safer up in Nazareth than in the Bethlehem area. So we have two very different narratives, but I would argue that Matthew, who is appealing to a different audience, so Luke is appealing to Gentiles, possibly more Jewish diaspora in the Greek-speaking world, or Hellenized sort of world, and to the Gentiles themselves. So he's got a different audience than Matthew, who is arguably appealing to Jews. So our audiences dictate how you're going to write things. They will dictate how you're going to deliver your objective, and indeed, to some degree, will influence your objective in and of itself. I would argue that Matthew, in trying to appeal to the Jewish audience, is saying with the Magi, the Zoroastrians, saying that this is a really big religion that's important to us culturally around us, but it's like the competitors. So it's saying that here are the Zoroastrian sort of wise men, and I'm bringing them into here, and even they are getting down and giving worship to the Messiah, to Jesus. So this is a sense of Jesus trumping the wise men, the Zoroastrians. Luke, on the other hand, is having the humble, bucolic shepherds kneeling down and giving praise. So the shepherds are quite important figures in Greek literature. So his audience is different. He's appealing to these Gentiles and saying, hey, the humble and the meek here. We've got the shepherds getting involved. Matthew is saying, no, we've got these rich, important, super important people, arguably rich, important people from the Zoroastrian competition, if you like, and Jesus is trumping them and they are bowing down to Jesus. And so we've got two really different theological agendas. Would you broadly agree with that synopsis?
I would, and to add to that, I would also point like how Matthew is also trying to contrast the Magi, who are Gentiles, with the Jewish elite, who ultimately in the story will become Jesus's enemies. You have basically Herod and the scribes, the Pharisees, not even recognizing the sign of the Messiah in the sky, while these Gentiles in another land have already recognized the importance of the star and the Messiah that it's supposed to signal and come to worship him. Herod, he doesn't want to worship, he wants to kill. And later on, the scribes, the Pharisees, are the ultimate enemies of Jesus and are the ones who help trump up the charges to get him arrested and executed. That contrast already right at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. It also helps complete because at the very end, when Jesus gives the Great Commission and says, now spread the message to everybody, Jews and Gentiles all over the world, having that already established at the beginning, literally people from the ends of the world have come to Jesus to basically say, this is the one true king. And add to that as well, also the connection to the book of Daniel, because that's where the Magi are supposed to be from. They're only mentioned in Daniel, and they're supposed to basically, have in their prophecies, their weeks of years prophecy of then the Messiah coming, and basically get on the good side of the God, the one who actually does run things.
Yeah, so we have this situation where there are two different theological agendas going on, and there's theology being delivered, but it doesn't define this is what we so often see, I think, in the Gospels, in the Old and the New Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, that we have these things that are so brilliantly constructed from a theological point of view, but when you look at the fine details of the actual supposed facts of the matter, the kind of history, they kind of fall apart. It's like, well, why did Herod not follow the star himself? Why did he not send troops with the Magi down to Bethlehem? Just say, oh, we're going to come along and praise him as well. Send troops down there and bosh, there you go, kill him. It's like there's this get out of jail free card, which is like, oh, I'll tell you what, you go down and praise Jesus, Magi, and then just come back here and tell us, and then we'll go and praise him because you've told us where he is. And of course, the Magi have this dream and don't come back, but now suddenly, Herod doesn't know where Jesus is born, so has to go to the general area and slaughter a load of babies. Whereas the obvious thing that a murderous person would do is one of two things: either say to the Magi, screw you guys, take us with you, we are going to kill Jesus, but there's nothing you can do about it, or butter up the Magi and say, oh, we'll come with you, let's praise him as well, and then like double cross him at the end and kill Jesus. Like that's what Herod would have done, but that's not what happened. Yeah. So it's just completely unrealistic that you have the scribes and Herod that have not noticed this star. So how special really is the star if no one else appears to have noticed it, which is also the point of fact that is not corroborated in any other documentation, any ancient literature. So I don't know, it's thoroughly problematic when you look at the minutiae, the details.
Yeah. When it comes to those minutiae, two things come to mind. One is the fact that Herod and his scribes don't notice it. Some people make that as an argument, oh, it must have been astrological and only astrologers who do the calculations would be able to notice this. It can't be something obvious in the sky like a comet or a big bright new star. So there's that sort of logic. But on the other hand, when it comes to Herod in terms of character, Herod, even before he became this old and murderous towards his own family, he was already an extremely distrustful person. Before he even became king, when he was actually like co-ruling the Holy Land with his father and then later with his brother, he was already super suspicious of the Jewish elite and the Persians. There's actually a story that when when the Romans were going back and forth killing each other during their the last ends of their civil war, the Persians actually then helped support an usurper to become the new king of the Jews and become like one of the last actual Jewish Hasmonean kings. And so the Persians are actually literally sending troops, helping siege Jerusalem. And the story is that they were trying to broker a peace, and Herod's brother and the high priest go for negotiations, but Herod's like, no, I'm not going. I don't trust these guys. in this case, he was right, because the high priest and his brother then would be captured. The high priest would have his ear mutilated, so he couldn't be, he wasn't pure enough then to be high priest anymore. And his brother, he's tied up, and at least as the story as Josephus gives it, he knows he's going to be tortured to death, so he basically smashes his head against a rock to commit suicide.
My goodness.
So Herod already is untrusting of the Persians and the Magi as such already. They've already, and this is back in the 40s, then they, capture and kill his brother ultimately. So it's like, yeah, 40 years later, he's going to be completely trusting of the same group that's going to come in and say, by the way, you're not king anymore. This new kid is, you want to help us out? Sure.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah.
Yeah. The army that usurped me the first time has come back and is coming to say there's another new king in town. Yep, I am totally on board and is completely trusting of this group, even though you literally killed my brother last time.
Yeah.
This does not make the least bit of historical sense, knowing Herod's character.
So absolutely agreed, and that's really interesting sidebar on that, the background of Herod there, and the idea that committing suicide by bashing your face against something is just pretty...
I actually slightly doubt that story, because Jews usually don't commit suicide, and pretty much every story where there's a suicide involved, how Josephus knows about it is by questionable sources, including like the Masada story. So I'm a little bit, I don't quite trust that, but nonetheless, the story is his brother is dead by the end of the story.
Yeah. So we had comets. So what's the next naturalistic explanation?
Yeah. So very commonly, all sorts of different combinations of the planets, whether it's Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter and Venus. Those are the two you'll see most commonly if you go to a planetarium show on the subject. Jupiter and Saturn.
These are called conjunctions, right?
Yes. So there's the technical version of a conjunction where the two planets are on the same line of right ascension, or effectively what is longitude. If you imagine drawing imaginary lines between the north celestial pole and the south one, if that line goes through the two planets, that's a conjunction. The more colloquial one is if two planets are close by, then that's a conjunction. But in either case, in 7 BC, there wasn't one, not two, but 3 conjunctions of the planets Jupiter and Saturn. And this was actually first really hyped up by Johannes Kepler, the famous astronomer and probably the last, truly scientific astrologer of the era. He didn't think that those conjunctions were the star itself, but he thought that these conjunctions should have been super important to the Magi and gotten their attention. He still thought the star itself was a separate object and was miraculously floating around the atmosphere, pointing out the correct house. But he first was pushing that, and later people then dropped the supernatural star and just kept with the conjunctions. More recently, starting in the 60s, people were basically starting to look at what else was in the sky at the time. And in the 60s, now we actually had electronic computers to go through and try things out, because you do not want to try out every possible combination by hand.
Right.
And so they find in 2 BC, there was an extremely close conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, so close that they probably would have looked like one object in the sky and would have been super brilliant and bright, just kind of like this object right here. Maybe not quite that bright, but it would have been fantastically observable. Problem, of course, with that is this is after the time Herod is supposed to be dead. So those who argue that also have to basically rewrite history.
Yeah, I mean,
which is a great way to show something is historical.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't touch on this because it would take too long, but the issue is that if you've got the Gospel of Luke's account has them going down for a census from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and we know that the census of Quirinius, which is mentioned by Luke, that talks of Quirinius, happened in 6 CE, and we know that Herod died in 4 or 5 BCE. So you've got a 10 to 11 year gap between Luke and Matthew, and you can't harmonize them. Christians do try, and they try really, 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 really hard. And that's why I spend a lot of time in my book talking about trying to harmonize the fact that you cannot have Herod and the census at the same time. There wouldn't be a census under Herod. It was a client kingdom, so they just wouldn't have had a census. But so you have this issue. And what comes out of this is Christians try and doubt the dating of Herod and say, actually, we're not, But when you look at Josephus, so he's inaccurate about certain things, maybe like you talked about with these suicide accounts, but he's generally he's thought to be really accurate on his dates. And when you start pulling apart some dates, everything falls apart. So you got this whole set of dates, which is then you can corroborate with external sources and everything as well. So we're pretty darned sure that Herod died in 4 or 5 BCE. So when you're then linking back to what you're saying, when you're saying these conjunctions and this and that happened at these times, then if Herod's not alive at those times, the point is moot.
Yeah, and just so our audience knows why we even would trust Josephus on this. And not on other things. It depends in part, does he have an agenda? And also, does he have a source? When it comes to the life of Herod, he has pretty good sources, including Herod's own memoirs. He has the historical accounts from Nicholas of Damascus, who was Herod's advisor, so was basically literally in the court of Herod, including when he finally died. And Nicholas Damascus was supposed to write up a long history. We don't have that anymore, but Josephus, says that's one of his sources, among other things. So like when you literally have Herod's account and one of Herod's advisors' accounts, the chances of him being completely off on the years that he reigned is rather doubtful. And Josephus is pretty clear. He says it takes place in this consular year, in this Olympian year. That's when he was declared king by the Roman Senate. And another time, and again in a consular year, we're told when he started officially reigning, when he finally kicked out the Persian forces out of Jerusalem and took control in reality and not just declared so. And then we're told on both of those years how many years Herod reigned. It's a simple math problem, and everyone trying to argue that.
Yeah, it's not just that though, because you also get like external sources talking about, if it's not about Herod, then it's the next ruler, and so therefore, if you've got external sources saying, well, the next ruler ruled from here to here. And we've got coinage, or we've got this and we've got that. You've got all these things that you can bring into account. It's not a case of like, oh, Josephus got Herod's death wrong. And it actually might have happened in 1 BC. No, because that then shifts the next ruler on a bunch of years, which we've got accounts for from other people. And so you've got a whole network of different sources giving us a really accurate sense of if we don't know the details of certain events, like what happened in the court on this day and blah, 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 because that's a bit, we know the dates. These sorts of things are much more reliable facts, if you like. And so when we know that Herod Archelaus, that Herod the Great's son, took over for 10 years and he ruled for 10 years, and we know that the census of Quirinius happened because the Roman Empire took back control of the client kingdom from Herod Archelaus because he was doing such a bad job, and they then said, right, we want to take control of this, and so therefore when we're going to take control, we need to know how much it's worth, and we need to know what we can tax it, so we need a census. That's why the census of Quirinius took place in 6 CE, and we know that had been 10 years of rule of Archelaus, which means that Herod is going to be dying in 4 BC, and it all makes sense. Sorry, I banging on.
Well, it's almost like you've studied the subject.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once we get to the historical nitty-gritty, the interesting thing when I try looking at the Star of Bethlehem literature is the response to these problems. So some will try to say, oh, all these problems with the census and the other dating can be reconciled, and I'm just going to focus on the star story. Others will be more clear, like one of the better books on the subject by another astronomer, Michael Molnar. He, early in his book, he'll basically say, yeah, these two sources contradict. There's no way to really reconcile them, but I'm going to take them at the end account and try to then, fit his horoscopic astrology to it and make that work.
Yeah. So he's like, I'm going to drop Luke. Let's forget about Luke. I'm not going to deal with that problem. Here's how Matthew works.
Yeah. And of course, if you get more evangelical scholarship that still tries to promote a naturalistic version of the star, then they'll also say there's going to be some way to reconcile, because as we know, the Bible is absolutely perfect, no contradictions, no lack of clarity. Everything is absolutely pristine, except when it's not.
Of course, yes. So, so they're the conjunctions. So after the conjunctions, what are the other explanations that you could have?
Yeah, so it could potentially be supernova, or at least that's claimed. And again, this is an exploding star that would just look like a big, bright new star in the sky. The word nova itself literally means new star, nova meaning new. Others will propose maybe it was an early discovery of planet Uranus, even though it's just outside of what the human eye can detect. And it was only first discovered once we invented the telescope. They'll say maybe somehow that's what they saw. That's been suggested. Somehow a meteor or meteor shower, somehow like shooting in the right direction to point them to the house. And then, of course, you have obviously the best possible hypothesis: aliens done it.
Brilliant. So who's proposed that? Is that realistically what some people have said?
So here's the thing that I've actually discovered about this, that originally the idea goes back to two different sources that kind of converge together in the modern form that you find on the obviously super authentic Ancient Aliens program on the History Channel. So one source, basically, it comes from those that are trying to rationalize the theology of it. And the other source, and the one that actually probably is more influential, is literal Soviet propaganda.
Right.
That quite literally.
I knew it'd be the communists that did it. Those commies.
Yeah, strangely enough, that is actually true. I'm not even making this up, because the Soviets, in their efforts to try to attack Western culture, Western values, and that they basically were trying to figure out what sorts of things can we put out there that will help undermine the system. So one of the most famous success stories of Soviet propaganda going into the West and causing problems is the idea that AIDS, or the HIV virus, was engineered to attack African Americans. That actually started as Soviet propaganda that was first filtered into newspapers in India, and then from there allowing it to generate through the rest of Western media. And then now, even today, many people still believe that, yeah, AIDS was actually created to hurt and kill African Americans.
Yeah, I've actually seen that when I was researching that a couple of years back. Yeah, I was pretty surprised at that. But this is the nature of the war that's going on now with Putin. Why bother building tanks and nuclear missiles when you can just build a apartment block of apartments and just stuff it full of bloggers and people on the internet just hacking and spreading misinformation, and it does far more damage, like in a real existential sense. It's getting called now epistemic what was it an existential, I forget what it is. There's a term for this new sort of crisis in reality, which is an epistemic crisis that we're having, and that kind of approach has so much purchase. So so you got aliens and communists working.
Yeah. So in some of the literature, they're trying to actually argue that the various biblical miracles, like Sodom and Gomorrah, that was actually a nuclear weapon from aliens and things like that, with the idea, if the Bible is now just aliens, then that's going to undermine theism.
Right.
But apparently, like, these Soviet sources didn't realize that there was actually people in the West already that were trying to take the miracles and make them natural anyway. So there was already a homegrown version of ancient aliens even before the Soviets came in. But the Soviet version of it is the one that actually then gets repeated in sources. In particular, there was a magazine called Sputnik, which was a Western-facing Russian magazine. So it's in English, but it's basically Kremlin-controlled and pushing out things to the West. And among those things was the whole ancient alien stuff. And quite literally, like, even the cover art from the article for that makes it into the books of Erich von Däniken.
Right. Yeah. Classic.
And also these ideas then get repeated in other sources, and literally in the vault of UFO research done by the FBI includes these sorts of articles. And later government sources are even like citing this as like reasons to be worried about basically either Soviet propaganda, or we need to actually take seriously about possible aliens and using these sorts of things. So quite literally, Soviet propaganda has become a major hypothesis for the Bethlehem star.
Yeah. So that does that. So what we have: comets, stars themselves, conjunctions of planets from our own solar system, hypernova or supernova. And aliens. So those are, does that cover the suite of naturalistic explanations?
Most of them. There's still more we can throw in. There's atmospheric phenomenon such as ball lightning, or relatedly St. Elmo's fire, that has been thrown out there as a possibility. There are stars that are called variable stars.
Sorry, can you explain St. Elmo's fire? Because I'm imagining Emilio Estevez and someone with the saxophone going.
Basically, it's ultimately some sort of a static discharge that almost like spontaneously could create lightning or fire.
Right.
Ball lightning is then, as the name kind of suggests, like literally looks like a ball of electricity, and it's been very hard to study scientifically. It's been very hard to like reproduce in a lab, but the number of non-scientific sources mentioning it, like it appearing and then like, either floating around or even occasionally rarely exploding, has been enough to show that, it is a real phenomenon. It's just not well understood.
Yeah.
It's an unlikely hypothesis because, again, the phenomenon itself only lasts a matter of seconds. It probably wouldn't have been able to guide the wise men to Bethlehem over a couple of hours. And also the fact that it should have exploded. I think Matthew would have noted that because, well, anytime there's an explosion, I write it down.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's see here. There's variable stars where stars will actually change their brightness from night to night or from hour to hour. There's a few of those that do that for, so for example, in the constellation Perseus, the hero who is carrying the head of Medusa, right at the head of Medusa, there's a star called Algol. It's often even called the demon head or demon star. And it actually does fluctuate in brightness because there's another star going around it that's not as bright. And one will occult the other and make it go a little bit dimmer for a few minutes or hours. We don't have any ancient records of anyone noticing that's a variable star, but it's a well-known variable star for astronomers today.
So brilliant. So we have this suite of naturalistic explanations. Can any of them work, or what's the most likely one, and what are their fundamental problems with explaining the Star of Bethlehem?
So there are two forks that I see of problems that both poke at any naturalistic hypothesis, and I ultimately should deflate that balloon. One is if you're going to say what the combination of stars or planets means to an ancient person, the sources we have would suggest that you can't possibly say what they would have thought. If you look at the various astrological texts, you're going to find out those guys couldn't figure out for themselves what any combination of stars would actually mean. So, for example, those who are going to say that Jupiter and Venus together are going to be a divine sign because Jupiter is the king star, Venus is this beautiful, brilliant star. So in their combination, that must be something magisterial. If you flip back, though, to ancient cuneiform records, they'd say, well, when they're in combination, a king's going to die.
Yeah.
Oops. So which of these two are going to believe what someone else can dream up and say, or what this record says? And the astrologers themselves, for the same horoscope, will completely contradict each other.
Is it even worse than that? Can you use an inductive argument to say that? Because I don't know, but maybe you know. Is there any evidence of anyone in the history of humanity following a star? Like literally going, right, there's some crazy stars here. Let's go and follow this star. Like I'm not aware of that ever taking place. So therefore, just in and of itself, you're saying this is the most implausible scenario. And there's no evidence that anyone in the history of humanity has actually done something like this, which is to say, oh, look, there's a really impressive sign in the sky. Let's pack our bags, pack some camels, and then just travel following that star, knowing that stars, as you talk about the rotation of the Earth, as it orbits or as it rotates, doesn't make any sense. So is there any example in the history of humanity of people following stars?
History, no. Myth, yes. So we have two sources that come to mind about people following stars. So one is a Spartan general by the name of Timoleon. And during a storm, apparently he was being given a divine assistance by the Gemini twins. And apparently a star would show up in front of his boat so that way he could guide them along his way on his mission to Sicily. And again, this is during a storm, so it's not even plausible that it could be any star in the sky. And perhaps even more important to the story is the star that led the Trojans to Rome, in particular, as described in the Aeneid, which basically is a grand myth for the Romans and all propaganda for Caesar Augustus. And in that story, Aeneas's father is praying for some sort of divine assistance for the fleeing Trojans who just basically, just had their hometown burned down by the invading Greeks. Oh, those guys, we'll get them eventually. And lo and behold, a bright, star comes streaming through at treetop level, and is supposed to be their guide to their new homeland. And in other commentaries, they'll say that this star was actually Venus, like the goddess Venus, guiding them to where they would set their new home up on the 7 hills of Rome. And then eventually, of course, the Romans get the revenge on those darn Greeks.
And does this predate Matthew?
Yes. Let's see, I forget exactly which year Virgil himself dies, but it's in the BCs. I forget exactly which year, but yeah, decades before Matthew's written, even a couple decades before Jesus is allegedly born.
And when we're talking about the nativity accounts of Matthew and Luke, my thesis, and many skeptics' thesis, is that Jesus has to be trumping Caesar Augustus. So whatever, when you're talking about Caesar Augustus or any kind of prominent person for people at the time, Jesus has to be it's a brinkmanship, it's a one-upmanship of like, Jesus is Caesar Augustus +1, he's Moses +1, he's, all of these figures, he is then plus. So you will get, it's no surprise that Jesus has a miraculous birth, rather, in the same sort of train of thought as Caesar Augustus and these prominent figures. And so it fits in with the mold, and that's really interesting that there's a precursor for following a star that would be quite an obvious sort of motif to draw on if you wanted to.
Exactly, yeah. And then, of course, conversely, if someone did try following a random star and just following in direction, ultimately would end up just ping-ponging back and forth, and you would never get to any particular destination. There was a somewhat funny version of that. Are you familiar with the webcomic series XKCD? Yeah, they did the author Randall Munroe did a what if on his website, and said, well, what if the wise men were following a star, and very, very literally following a star, and he's like, okay, well, using the ephemeris for a given star or planet over long periods of time, it's like, okay, well, if they followed Venus, they would bounce around like this, and eventually they'd end up at the South Pole, or weird things like that. At the very least, it would not get you if you had a very particular destination in mind, let alone a particular house.
Yeah. So that's okay. So that was that one fork. What was another fork? You were talking about 2 forks of how you would attack.
Yes. Yeah. So the first fork is, as to repeat, because I think everyone might have lost track.
Yeah.
The first fork is, it's almost impossible to really say what any star in the sky or combination of stars would have meant.
Yes.
The astrologers are basically tripping over themselves in interpretation and are completely contradictory. The second fork is, if you're trying to actually explain the story as it is described, no naturalistic hypothesis can possibly fit. It is going out of its way, honestly, to be supernatural. And we can look at that by looking at like the individual words and showing why that's the case. But also, if you don't want to take my word for it, let's take it from the word of a famous theologian and former astrologer, Saint Augustine.
Right.
Before he became a Christian, he actually had to study astrology and know about it, because he was part of what was called the Manichaean faith, and many believed in all sorts of astrological, astronomical things as part of his mythology. And Augustine had to understand that as well. Eventually, he threw that all off, and when he is discussing the Star of Bethlehem with another Manichaean, he is going out of his way and saying, there is no way that you can apply astrology to Jesus or this star, because this star is traveling south, it is hovering over a particular house, it is breaking away from the regular motions of the planets and stars. The stars, Jesus did not shine because of the stars shined for Jesus. This is a supernatural event through and through, and trying to treat it with astrology is nonsense. So if you have a problem with me, take it up with Augustine.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think, for me, that's good enough now? We could go into the finer details, but just to so that we can get to where we're going, following our own star, let's assume, or not assume, I think it's fairly obvious that naturalistic explanations fail, and fail quite obviously for those two main reasons. We don't know what they mean, and it's hard to explain how Magi, an important, probably astrologically astute people and astronomically astute people, would suddenly get up and follow a star, a natural star, and then no natural star would behave like that and be able to indicate a single house. So it just like, it doesn't work. So let's assume that it doesn't work. Why why do people keep trying to make it work? I mean, what's going on here? There's obviously psychology. There's wanting to rationally justify their belief. Why not a supernatural? Why don't they just go for a supernatural explanation?
Yeah, the interesting thing is I even find some divide on this within conservative or evangelical Christian circles right now, because I was very kind of blown away to discover that among the young Earth creationists, there's actually a bit of a divide on how to interpret this story. Now, if you go to a website like Answers to Genesis, most of them will side with it being a supernatural thing. They obviously have no problems with the miracles. But a figure who did actually think the star could be naturalistically explained was Henry Morris, basically the founder of flood geology. So it was very surprising. Like, here is someone who is, trying to, prove the literal 6,000 year Earth, global flood, all those things. The Star of Bethlehem, oh, that might be a supernova. That kind of blew me away that could exist there in such literalistic circles. But how that is done, it seems like there can be a couple of motivations. One is the deistic motivation, the one that also kind of influenced me, that a God who can, cause things to happen completely within historical circumstance, completely within naturalistic forces, looks like amazing foreplanning on the part of the Almighty. And to get, the stars right and have the birth right and have the people interpret the stars right, that would require a level of determinism that I think would even make John Calvin blush.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, considering like not only do you have to get the planets in the right position, but you have to influence human culture to interpret it the right way. That is, once you think about it, you realize, oh, wow, forget free will. That is gone.
yeah, that's proper theological determinism.
Yeah, but also there is the point of, if you want to figure out really when Jesus was born, if you're trying to, determine that history, and you can actually use astronomy and get down to like the hour that the Star of Bethlehem is supposed to have formed, that, already, helps anchor things in history. It also becomes very good apologetics. There was one article I found in particular that said, okay, well, use astronomy and astrology to explain the star this much and date things, but the star is ultimately supernatural. But nonetheless, we can use the naturalistic stuff for the purpose of promoting the faith. So it literally said, let's have a natural supernatural hybrid to have our cake and eat it too.
If you're talking about a third party, potential convert, so you then a naturalistic explanation is going to find more purchase with them than just merely asserting some crazy miracle, right? So I get that.
Yeah, and like the idea of explaining it naturalistically, it does influence people and it does impress people. I mean, I give my own personal example, but let me also give a more British example. Did you watch the BBC Nativity story from 5-ish years ago? It was a mini series a few years ago on BBC.
Oh, is that the one with Keisha Castle-Hughes, who was in The Whale Rider, a Kiwi actress?
I think so.
That was a film. But yeah, carry on.
Yeah, I forget. I remember though, one of the Magi was played by Peter Capaldi.
Oh, right. Nice.
Yeah, so Doctor Who was a Magi.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a Magus, I should say. But nonetheless, the director for that, did his research.
Get your declensions correct, please.
Yes.
Sorry, carry on.
Yes, I'll practice my German later. Meine Fehler. Okay. So the director for the BBC production, really did his homework, and it actually made him more religious in going from basically a secular upbringing, or not very religious upbringing, at least, to saying there is more to the story. By first off, he tried doing a lot to humanize the story of Mary and Joseph, because the story as is does not leave much for the imagination of a deep romantic partner. And of course, how did Joseph take the the story? It's like, my wife is pregnant, I didn't do anything, but God told me in a dream that this is okay. How would someone really take that? That was an interesting thing to look to. But also, the director for this, I forget his name right now, but I had a little bit of email conversation with him to confirm a couple things. But he went out of his way to make the Star of Bethlehem naturalistic. He even had the camera go into space to look at the planets. And if you listen, you can actually literally hear the gears of the universe churning away.
Wow.
to really say like how timed out, how planned this whole process was. And this made the story feel more real and more important and more, plausible that way. So yeah, in terms of evangelism, it seems to work. And I can show other anecdotes as well. When people are introduced with this naturalistic version of the star, it is emotionally powerful.
Right, and I wonder, does that apply to other story? I mean, it surely must do. So if you're going to say something like the plagues of Egypt, and you say actually we have some scant evidence that the Nile can turn red, or that we've got plagues of locusts, obviously, and this X, Y, and Z, or there's been a chariot wheel found under the Red Sea or whatever.
Yeah.
People go, oh, I told you. It's that kind of like, not only the added evidence for them to bolster their own belief, but it's ammunition that they can use to convert others or to win the argument. So yeah,
exactly.
No, totally understand that.
Yeah. But there is nonetheless that kind of weird tension amongst those who are thoroughly supernaturalistic that still seem to want to go out of the way and provide something at least partially naturalistic. It seems like the fewer miracles, the better. And that's just the scientific worldview entering your brain, even if you're trying to push it out as a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, of course. If you look at a miraculous claim as being a least probable explanation for data, then you're multiplying that probability, or making it much smaller. Actually, the probability that all of these things are true, given that each one is an extra very low probability. So if some of them can be like, actually this one here is can be naturalistically explained, then it makes the whole suite of claims more plausible, doesn't it? But
or even on top of that, even though, like I say, even those who say they have absolutely no problem with miracles, that they see 10 miracles before they have breakfast, those who are that deep into supernaturalism, nonetheless, like if you look at again the literature of say young Earth creationists, they're going to try to come up with naturalistic models for how the flood waters were released and where they went and things like that. There is still that need, that desire to make things fit with the laws of nature, because clearly there are laws of nature. And how do you bring that into your world where God also every so often just says, frick off laws, I need to do something.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. So I've wrote a piece and did a YouTube video about, say, the global flood, which is this idea that that if God has done this huge miracle and you have interaction with the physical world, so we should be able to test the hypothesis, because actually there should be evidence left over that a massive global flood, for example, took place. So it's not, yes, God can supernaturally put these things in place, but then they will leave their mark because there is physical interaction taking place. So in order to then say, well, there is none of this evidence, you have to say, well, God swept it all away. Why would God want to hide everything afterwards? But like I said earlier, this isn't quite the case with the star, because you can posit that God put this supernatural thing there, but it wouldn't show any evidence. I mean, it's just some visual thing at a distance, rather than a huge body of water killing all life on Earth apart from a bit of life, and arguably would be crushing the Earth's crust or whatever, right? So there will definitely be evidence for that, but it's slightly different with these supernatural stars. So I think theists can get away, or Christians can get away with positing this supernatural event of a star and being fine with that, because it's just a glowing thing in the sky, and it's not going to leave its mark.
Right. And yet they'll still jump to it, and in part because, well, it's one of the few things you could do to try to verify the birth story, because everything else from it, you have to posit all sorts of things to make it not historically impossible. You have to find some excuse for why the slaughter of the innocents isn't mentioned. You have all the other supernatural things that are like the virgin birth, which you can't possibly verify today. We don't have Jesus's DNA to check that he only has X chromosomes, which would be the case if he was, virgin birth just from Mary. The only thing that we could possibly do to verify it would then be literally using the power of physics to verify something. And of course, the idea that you could use physics or astronomy to prove the Bible, that's clearly a powerful motivating force.
Yeah. So okay. So assume then now that Christians are now saying, okay, we can't do it we can't explain this naturalistically. Dr. Adair's come along and he said that this doesn't work and that doesn't work. Okay, fair enough. It's a supernatural star. What are the problems with positing it's a supernatural star?
All right. And of course, we're going beyond the whole, every time we've ever tried to check into a miracle, it comes out to be faulty.
Yeah.
Besides all of world history.
the inductive reasoning of that, like I always say, like, I love Richard Carrier's analogy of a horse race. Every, supernaturalism has been supplanted by naturalism as an explanation like 10,000 times in a row. Like Thor's hammer doesn't explain thunder and lightning, etc., etc. We now understand it in terms of X, Y, and Z physics. Mm-hmm. Supernaturalism has never supplanted naturalism. So if you're going to look for who's going to win this next explanatory horse race, are you going to bet on a horse that's won 10,000 times in a row, or are you going to bet on a horse that's never won? Yeah. So we've got good inductive reason to suggest that naturalism will win out, but here you can get away with asserting that, as I said, that this is a supernatural explanation because you can't disprove it at all. It's not like like if you're saying that thunder is caused by Thor's hammer or whatever, or lightning, we can then say, well, actually no, because here's how thunder and how lightning works. If you're going to say the Star of Bethlehem is caused by God shining a light there, we can't say no, because this is actually no, this is just the light that's in heaven. So it's that difficult. So again, how do we disprove, or how do we show that the supernatural doesn't work?
Right. So the way to me to do that is pointing out that there is general historical implausibility with the story, even accepting the supernatural. So there could be the theological problem that you brought up earlier. Why didn't God just direct the Magi to Bethlehem in the first place? Is this really the best possible world that includes dead babies? Yeah. That already is at least a theological problem. But again, let's just assume that God isn't anything like we believe it is. It's just the version that we're told about. So all we're left is with the human actors. And again, let's consider the scenario. We have Magi coming from Persia. And again, the evidence which suggests to me that these are members of the Zoroastrian priesthood. Let's talk about them. So when we talk about them being priests, we're not talking about like your local rabbi or a pastor down the road. No, these are actually members who function as a part of the Persian Empire's government. Not only are they basically intercessing between the natural and the supernatural realm, not only are they giving advice to the king, they actually also choose who becomes king. They are integral to the functioning of the government. So having people come from the Persian government to Israel, to Roman client kingdom, is itself an international incident. And then coming into Roman territory to tell that king there that someone else is supposed to be ruling that land, you are usurping not just the authority of Herod, but the authority of Caesar Augustus. And that nobody notices this sort of thing, which should have caused a war. And when I say should have, we have other precedents of this happening in Armenia when Rome and Persia have arguments about who is going to be king there, because it's a buffer zone between the two empires. And sometimes this has led to war. There have been numerous wars even between Rome and Persia before the birth of Christ. But Caesar Augustus had worked out a brilliant tactical political move to cause peace between the two countries. If the Persians then basically came along and then did effectively a declaration of war saying you aren't sovereign in this territory anymore, this should have been, absurdly mentioned and led to troops being sent. Also, it's pretty stupid because the Persian king had several of his sons living in Rome at the time, basically as hostages, as well as getting a Roman education. And you would have thought first that it's like, oh, you want to usurp my authority in Israel? Well, let me usurp your son. Yeah. That's what should have happened. And yet no one even notices this international incident. If I can give an analogy, it would be like if today members of the Japanese parliament went into Tibet to declare the new Dalai Lama and the Chinese government did nothing.
Yeah. Interesting. I was thinking as well, the idea that the star disappeared And there's a bit more clarity I have on this. I need to go back and look at my book and see whether I've been as clear as this. But the star disappeared. Now, if you're a supernaturalist, God, or even if you're a naturalist, but if you're a supernaturalist, God is controlling this star. No one else is controlling this star. This star is singularly controlled by God, right? So if it leads them to Jerusalem in the first place, but also if it disappears for a bit and then appears again, right, then this is God willing, very actively willing the Magi to go to Jerusalem, which is very actively willing Herod to get involved. This is God saying, I want Herod involved. It's similar to the dream sequence as well. Like why did they not have the dream sequence before Jerusalem? It's exactly the same theory, which is God is wanting Herod to be, very clearly wanting Herod to be involved, and therefore very clearly wanting Herod to slaughter the innocents. In other words, it's on God, the death of those children, however many children you agree it is. It didn't need to happen, but God controlled the star so that it led them to Jerusalem, and then so that they got Herod involved, so that they then picked it up again after getting Herod involved, so that they went down to Bethlehem, so that Herod, who's now involved and didn't need to be involved, then goes down to slaughter those innocents, all because Jesus was born. So the argument against the supernatural, I think, is this theological. I think the theological argument is really super strong.
Oh yeah, and not to mention, since it's supposed to, in quote, fulfill prophecy, this is a huge amount of foreknowledge on the part of God and a huge amount of planning that I am going to, several centuries from now, have babies slaughtered so that way I have a literary trope fulfilled for my son. That is some vile theism.
Yeah, I talk about that in a couple of my books about that theological determinism that you have to have when you have prophecy. I think it's a real problem.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if we want to go with the evil God challenge, it's like, okay, God is just evil.
Yeah. The other argument might be as well that no one else sees this star. So you have we hinted at this, the very astrologically and astronomically astute cultures around and people around surely would have seen this if these Magi see it. So the only and no one else sees it, and there's no account of this anywhere in history. So that you've got two options. One is that weirdly conveniently no one documented this star at all. How likely is that? Very unlikely. And the other one is it only appeared to the Magi.
Yes. And it's also weird because the fact that it's Magi that are part of this story, that are supposed to be the ones that are so deeply knowledgeable of astronomy or astrology, is actually a sign also that Matthew doesn't know what he's talking about, and he's actually steeped in stereotypes rather than history, because it was a Greco-Roman stereotype that astrology came from people like Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism. Now, why would they even think such a thing? Because the name Zoroaster, aster looks like the Greek word for star, therefore he did star stuff. That's literally what the Greeks were thinking. Right. In reality, from what we can actually tell from Persian sources, the Magi had no interest in astrology at this time. And in fact, later on, they're actually explicit. The planets are evil because they move. So the people who are the most interested in the moving stars are the people who should have found them the most horrible things to look at.
That's fascinating.
So it's absolutely absurd on that front as well, because if they're supposed to be astrologers, they're the least astrological of the priestly groups of that time. So again, it just shows that, hey, the person writing this is using Greco-Roman stereotyping to create the narrative. And of course, like most stereotypes, not that well connected to reality.
And what's really interesting about, well, first of all, have you got any other arguments against the supernatural thesis?
Well, there's also the fact that we have the irreconcilable differences between Matthew and Luke. There's no corroboration between these sources. And Matthew seems to go out of his way to show he is unreliable. I'll give an example. The story at the death of Jesus, which first is described in the Gospel of Mark, which includes 3 hours of darkness at noon, which, by the way, can't actually happen as described. The temple veil being ripped in half, which also is implausible. Matthew inherits that story, as most Bible scholars will say, but he looks at that story and he says, Mark, hold my wine, I'm adding to this. And what does he add to it? He adds a rock-splitting earthquake and a zombie apocalypse.
This is my favorite part of the whole resurrection
Yes.
account, this, because it's just clearly never happened, right? And it's just bonkers.
Yeah, and the fact is, like, he's already taken a story that's already clearly, pretty crazy on its own and decided, I need to up the ante. I need to make this even crazier.
He was like thinking, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? Zombies. That's it. Zombies. Like, what story's not complete without zombies?
Exactly. And the thing is, if you look it back into the Greek and you actually see what he's doing, he's actually taking key words from a particular passage from the book of Ezekiel, from the prophecies of Ezekiel, where he has this vision. And in the Hebrew, it says he hears a voice and then he sees like skeletons basically coming to life. In the Greek, though, he hears a rumbling, the word that's actually used for earthquake. And we see like the same words for like tombs and rising out of the grave being used in Matthew. So he's clearly using the Septuagint version of the Hebrew prophet to talk about a zombie apocalypse. And it's just like, he gave the game away. I'm sorry. We see how he makes these stories and it isn't historical sourcing.
Brilliant. So I think just to start wrapping things up, and it would be great to have another chat again sometime, because there's so much to talk about, to delve into all the stuff that you know about lots of things. But with regard to the Star of Bethlehem, I was thinking one could accuse people like us in dissecting this very small event of saying, well, it's just the Star of Bethlehem, it's not really that important, why spend so much time talking about this? But actually, this is crucial to Matthew. I think if you start saying the Star of Bethlehem doesn't work, right? It doesn't work for theological, naturalistic, supernatural, whatever, all these different reasons. It's just a sort of literary mechanism, blah, blah, blah. Then what happens is the whole of Matthew's nativity account falls down. So I think that it is more important than that. I think the Star of Bethlehem is actually like the linchpin of Matthew's account, because if you don't have the Star of Bethlehem, you don't have the Magi, you don't have Herod, and then all you have is just Jesus being born. Mm-hmm. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the fact that it seems so clear once it's critically examined that the nativity story in general, and the Star of Bethlehem in particular more so, is theologically created. It's not based on historical memory or oral tradition. It looks like it is purposeful manufacturing by the author of the Gospel of Matthew, that he is going out of his way to make this part of his larger narrative, and it's not just a little tack on of something he heard. Once you realize that, it makes you have to read the rest of the gospel story and say, okay, if he is willing to make these things up, if he's willing to push this sort of theological narrative, how does this mean we then analyze the rest of the story? And in terms of whether it's finding a historical Jesus or arguing for theism in general, once you find out this is the sort of author he is, that should make you treat the rest of the story with at least similar skepticism.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was my whole kind of point of the Nativity, a critical examination, and my resurrection one, which is around it somewhere. I'll go on then. And the resurrection one. So that, which is to say that if you can find that those two bookends of the birth and death of Jesus, which are the two areas where the claims of the Gospels intersect with known history, right? So this is our verifiability. And if you say that the birth and the death of Jesus are historically really, really, really problematic, and in fact, almost certainly didn't happen, then what does this say about the rest of the Gospels? All that stuff in the middle between the Jesus ministry, where all this theology is being delivered, where all the teachings of Jesus is coming from. If the only two times that we've got verifiability, the accounts fall down, what epistemic warrants do you have? What right do you have to believe all the stuff in the middle? So I think, stuff like this is super important.
Yes. And then, of course, conversely, once you realize that he's not trying to record history, but theology, then you can approach the text in much more interesting ways and say, oh, here he's using Pesher technique, or here he's alluding to some sort of Greco-Roman story and adopting that. Once you allow that sort of thing, it makes so much more sense of what's actually written, And frankly, it becomes more enjoyable.
Yeah, I've been saying this a lot recently. You just gave me a shiver down my spine, actually. Like the Gospels are brilliant pieces of literature, because when you realize all the intertextuality that they're using, all the allusions that they're using, how Matthew is pulling on the Old Testament and saying and recreating Moses through Jesus and doing this and doing that, and this is a reference to that. When you understand it anthropologically for what it is, as this kind of cultural construction of this figure, then these are quite remarkable literary accomplishments. They're not history, and you're foolish, in my opinion. You're foolish to believe that they are history. But once you drop that, then you start being able to appreciate them for really what they are, and they are all the more remarkable for that.
Yeah, you have to keep two things in mind. The story is in history, but the author is brilliant. Yeah. And once you take that gives you a much more accurate paradigm to research things. Like, for example, I discovered a recent article that is explaining the quotations from Matthew. So back in the birth narrative, you have like 5 clear quotations from scripture, or at least allegedly scripture, and they almost look random. There's, of course, the mistranslation of virgin from the Hebrew. There's the Nazareth prophecy, which doesn't seem to come from anywhere. There's other combinations to say Jesus was born in Bethlehem, or there had to be a slaughter of babies. It almost looks like a random hodgepodge of anything Matthew is pulling from the Old Testament. But an article I read recently actually argued that no, there actually is a logic to this if we look at the Pesher technique used of like the Dead Sea Scrolls in that, and you can see that actually it's a Pesher specifically on Isaiah chapter 7 through 9 and about like a return from exile. And then you see that like the entire nativity story and the quotations are actually built on that sort of Pesher commentary on Isaiah, and it becomes from random collections of passages to brilliant authorship. And you don't do that if you just think he's just trying to record history, or he's just saying things are fulfilling prophecy. No, once you realize this is a literary work and you see the literary techniques he uses, it goes to a new level of brilliance and appreciability.
Yeah, and just to explain what Pesher is, so Pesher is this kind of rabbinic tradition of reinterpreting stories for a new audience in a current way, to make it come alive again in a sense. You get sort of the ideas of midrash and pesher, and they kind of sometimes get confused. But yeah, and I think what you have here is retelling those Old Testament stories in a new and current way to give them new life, but actually with added theology. So with a Christology in there, or not high Christology, a sort of messianic theology thrown in there as well. Cool. Is there anything else you wanted to add to Star of Bethlehem? Any points?
So just to also give a little bit more background to foreground. So this book came out now about 8-ish years ago. And of course, while I still think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, definitely, other things have been written since then. In particular, I was part of a conference about the Star of Bethlehem that took place in the Netherlands that was then turned into this giant tome that was published by Brill. Which is one of the top academic publishers, which also means that if you want to buy this book, you have to choose between this book or your rent.
Yeah, I could well imagine.
There actually is a paperback version that's much cheaper, but nonetheless, it's fairly expensive. But I do have a chapter in here, and it has many other important contributions. And fortunately, I also found that a lot of the points that I brought up in this book were being verified by other experts when it came to the history of astronomy and astrology, or the nature of the stories about Jesus being not the most historical. In particular, there was the scholar Annette Mertz, who literally wrote, yes, she literally wrote. Let's get the right book. Yes.
It's an absolute, yes. This is a seminal text, the historical.
Yeah, I was going to say, she literally wrote the book on the historical Jesus with Gerd Thiessen, and she actually cites my book positively when it came to deductions about the Greek.
Wow, that's good.
Yeah, so when you get a historical Jesus scholar citing you, saying you're right, you feel good inside.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. And I believe that you have an intention to bring out either a second edition or a replacement book that's got even more stuff in it.
Yes.
What have you learned since this book that you're hoping to add?
Yeah, so in part, I need to respond to some of the things that came out in that Brill volume, to either say, here are the people that are now, agreeing with me, I should cite them because that should be done. There are a few scholars who disagree with me, and I need to show them why their deductions don't follow, because a lot of it is just possibility equals probability fallacy.
Oh, possibility ergo probability. Yep. That's my favorite or least favorite fallacy in the world. It's so common, especially with the nativity.
Yeah. So there's some things to respond there. There was actually another Bible scholar who got his PhD from Cambridge, who wrote this big, massive volume. Let me pull that out, because the book itself, this one here called The Great Christ Comet, it's a hardcover. Every page has like colored photos. It's super beautiful. And I can't believe that they actually made any profit selling it, but it's also completely wrong. So I need to, respond to that. I actually had some conversation with him on the Unbelievable radio show a few years ago. But, I need to, reply in person, but also a few other things I want to build on. One, I learned more and more about the Soviet connection to the Star of Bethlehem. And I've also tried looking more deeply at the Star of Bethlehem in popular culture, in particular from medieval art to modern movies, and how that has changed with the changing scientific view, and why these ideas are so popular now, when if you go back 100 years ago, it wasn't in popular culture at all, but all of a sudden it changed. And I think part of the reason was it's an American phenomenon, and it goes back to the Scopes trial.
Really?
I think that's something I need to argue and prove. There's also a little bit more evidence I have found that kind of bolsters the idea that the Bethlehem star is at least somewhat ribbing off the Aeneas star, because I actually found a later Latin source who does this brilliant thing. She rewrites the entire gospel stories, and they're just all quotes from the writings of Virgil.
Wow.
And when she tells the nativity story, she includes nothing from Luke and only a couple things from Matthew. What does he include? The Aeneas star that led them to Rome. And it's like, okay, someone is seeing that connection. Maybe I'm not the only one who's crazy here.
Brilliant. Well, and then we talked about that earlier, and I think it's a fairly obvious connection. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, it's not obvious linguistically, because yeah.
Motif-wise.
Yeah, I've actually even discussed this a bit with Dennis McDonald. He doesn't see it as a strong argument, but I think I can now make a better case, though it's definitely not nearly as solid as other stuff he's done with Greco-Roman or with Homeric myth and Mark.
Yeah.
And what I want to be as my coup de grace is argue that there is actually a pre-Matthean source for the Bethlehem star story, but it's even more mythological.
Right. Interesting. Wow.
But I gotta leave that as a
little
something to make you salivate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really look forward to you to getting that done. And what I say to the viewers is it's not a massively thick book, which is nice. It's a perfect book to read and to romp through, and it's got so much in it. It packs a really good punch, and it is not just about the star in and of itself. Like we talked about, it has ramifications that are wider, but also we talk about biblical exegesis and lots of interesting stuff. So I'd really advise the viewers to get that. Please support Aaron's work, because it is fantastic, and he needs a lot more sort of coverage out there to make sure that the work as good as this gets the praise it deserves.
Yeah, it's an uphill battle, because in the media, it's much more popular to say there really was a star. Just last year, I actually was looking at this through a more analytic tool, looking at Twitter responses.
Yeah.
So last year, there was a really awesome conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, and it was taking place close to Christmas. And so all the media was calling it the Christmas star. Oh, this is the same sort of thing that happened back in 7 BC. And I looked at Twitter responses for Star of Bethlehem, and it just absolutely explodes around Christmas time last year. It even has more traction than the other very Christian phrase, Jesus is Lord.
Right.
It just explodes in popularity. So that's the fight I have to fight.
Yeah, I mean, you know, let's fight the good war for the war on Christmas. War on Christmas.
Yes, and if Christmas is going to be all year long, the war on Christmas has to be all year long, and that's what I'm here for.
Fighting a good fight. Well, look, I've really enjoyed talking to you, Aaron. As ever, I say as ever. We've only done it once before, but let's do this again. Let's talk, spread the topics out further to other areas that are interesting for you, or you find interesting. And that kind of what I wanted to speak to you about today was the rationalization of myths, which is, I know, something that you're quite interested in. So, but we'll park that for next time. But is there anything you wanted to add, or is there anywhere people can find you particularly that you want to throw out there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the place I probably have most everything aggregated to is my website, draaronadair.com. That includes links to my various social medias, blog, list of things that I have published, links to videos that I've done for other groups, and in theory, something that actually makes me look good, depending on what you think of my quality of website design. Yeah, but that's probably the best place to try to find me, and then through Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Passenger Pigeon, whatever.
Yeah, excellent. Well, look, Aaron, Dr. Aaron Adair, thank you so much for your time. Your book is fantastic, and what you say is really, really interesting, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.